All right, let's talk about Merfolk, Cephalids, and Vedalken in Magic the Gathering. Now, the reason I want to talk about all three together is they are all sort of related. Not necessarily in universe terms, but they were all created to kind of fill the same space. Let me explain. So, as most of you know, for the first 10 years or so of Magic, the story more or less took place either on Dominaria or planes very closely related to Dominaria that didn't change very much from the Dominaria standard. And internally, there was sort of a debate about Merfolk. And this was specifically about art direction stuff and how do we make a blue creature that appears like it can live on land? How do we have a merfolk that can be on the surface? And do we even want to do that? Like, is it still a merfolk if it can live on land? So anyway, for most of Magic's history, merfolk looked like this. This is sort of a standard Dominarian merfolk. This is the OG Lord of Atlantis. But even in Dominaria United, you can see that merfolk are pretty much the same with the long tails. The Suprazan merfolk on Mercadia were sort of their first attempt to do something different. The problem is the Suprazans were all over the place. This is a merfolk beast with a tail there, but this guy with the legs is also a Suprazan merfolk, as is the one I originally showed you. So it's reasonable to assume that either the Suprazans can shapeshift from fins to legs when they're on land, or there are one of each variety. But either way, we can kind of agree this is all over the place. So when Odyssey rolls around, they have a chance to try something new, and they create the Cephalids, which are squid beings, basically. Now, in lore on Dominaria, the Cephalids are rivals to the Merfolk, although they have a much smaller empire. But you can sort of get humanoid out of them if you work for it, and also it would make sense for them to walk around on land with their tentacles. Now, why couldn't Merfolk just slither around on land like a big snake thing? I don't know. I wasn't part of any of these debates. But Cephalids ended up being more or less one and done for 20 years until New Capenna. The next attempt at a blue equivalent to humans, goblins, elves, and whatever are basically our blue elves, the Vedalken. Now, the Vedalken are generally treated more as something like a Vulcan from Star Trek. They are very logic-driven people. The first time we see them is on Mirrodin, where they have 4 arms, and they have been changed over time by something called the Serum. I'm not going to get into that whole thing, but you'll note they also all had like little astronaut helmets with liquid. I believe it's supposed to be serum. Then skip forward a couple years, and on Ravnica, we also introduce the Vedalken, because Ravnica doesn't really have oceans yet. And so they need a blue characteristic people that when they don't have oceans. Now, the big difference here is obvious. Vedalken on Ravnica naturally only have 2 arms, whereas the Mirrodin Vedalken had 4 arms. Then in Lorwyn, we went back to Merfolk. We got white and blue varieties, and they all had a sort of catfish-like appearance, but importantly, they all also sort of had the long serpentine bodies of Dominarian Merfolk. They did not leave the rivers of Lorwyn. And when Shadowmoor came, while they had more of a deep-sea fish look, they still had the long, sinuous bodies, and they didn't leave the water, really. They can sort of slither up on land as well, but they don't like doing it, and they don't do it very often. We also got the Selkies, which are sort of manatee centaurs or seal centaurs. But again, same issue all around. These don't look like natural people on the surface, and do we even want them to be on the surface if they're merfolk? So of course, our next new plane on Alara, we went back to the Vedalken. And pretty standard Vedalken, except these are filigreed because they're from Esper. But otherwise, they're sort of like high-minded, logical thinkers. Then, a breakthrough. We had merfolk with legs. Now, what's important here is you can see they still have fins, and putting their feet together, they can still swim like a regular merfolk. But they have a standard look. They don't shapeshift between land and sea. And also, kind of importantly, they could also fill the small blue flyer role by flying on their flying manta rays. And then this sort of became the norm for merfolk, and Vedalkens and Cephalids faded away. So for instance, on Chandalar, we have these blue merfolk. Same deal, they have like calf fins. We even introduced merfolk to Ravnica when it originally didn't have any by lore reasons. Basically, sections of the city collapsed into oceans they had built over long ago. The merfolk came up and took over the Simic Guild. And because of Simic bioengineering, they all look a little bit different, but in general, they got kind of a lionfish vibe going on with a lot of very thin fins. On Theros, we got Tritons, and they're easily distinguishable by their fin crest on their head. And when Kaladesh came around, we went back to Vedalken. So it's something that they can swap out. Vedalken and Merfolk can coexist in the same set. We see that on Ravnica now. You know, as long as it's not like a typal theme, it doesn't really matter all that much. But the big difference with Vedalken here is that they have 6 fingers, which is, of course, a nightmare for artists and art directors. Keeping track of that ain't easy, folks, especially when you're working on, dozens of pieces. On Ixalan, we got Merfolk with 2 different variety. They had very long, flowing fins this time around. You have the blue variety and the green variety, which have slightly different colorings, but they belong to the same people. On Eldraine, we got sort of the darker fairy tale version of Merfolk. Like, there's one here who's very obviously, this is Ariel from The Little Mermaid, but in general, they're more murderous and very dangerous. On Arcavios at Strixhaven, we also got emo Merfolk. So what's fun about these is their forehead fins can be stylized to look like regular hairstyles. You'll see examples of this all throughout. I'm not going to go through a bunch of pictures, though, because I'm already 6 minutes in. And then wildly, we got Cephalids again. Now, these Cephalids are different. They're sort of a cross between Cephalids and what we do now with Merfolk, in that they are humanoids with octopi-like traits or squid-like traits. They've got some bioluminescence. The males have, like, the tentacles as, like, barbels. Have a little bit in the way of webbed hands. And then the females have tentacles as, like, their hair. Now, people who are Cephalid fans, and they do exist, we're not super happy about this, but I think this makes more sense than other options. And this is largely where we are today. But basically, Vedalken and Cephalids were both experiments in doing a characteristic blue creature type that was not a merfolk, while internally a sort of art direction debate kept going on how to approach merfolk and whether they should approach merfolk in certain ways. Cephalids and Vedalken were created during that time frame. They can now be used to do cool things like be added in for flavor on planes that may not have merfolk.